This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
And we are back in the dark room talking to Bernard T. Joy, friend of the show. I'm Brad Kelly. This is Kevin Kautzman. As if this is the first time you've listened to a dark room, basically what this means is we've done our deep dive investigation exploration profile on a great artist, and in the dark room we bring on somebody who knows that subject, or in this case subjects, a little better, sometimes a little differently. I think in this case probably a bit better, to sort of further develop our understanding of these figures. And in this case, Bernard T. Joy, for people who've been listening to the show or people who are just exist in literary Twitter, I know they're going to know who this guy is. He's got a PhD from the University of Glasgow with a thesis focused on William Faulkner. We talked quite a bit about that. I actually was checking the site. It was way back in August of 2022. I can't believe how fast time flies. So we'll be talking a little bit about Faulkner, but the reason this kind of we sort of set this up was A, we wanted to talk to Bernard again about anything, and B, I saw that in I think it's in May in Chicago at the American Literature Association's conference. Bernard's going to be talking in the William Faulkner Society panel about Faulkner, Tennessee Williams, and Flannery O'Connor, and all three of those are subjects that we have talked about in depth on Art of Darkness. So we thought, hey, this is going to be fresh in Bernard's mind. It's fresh in our mind. This is perfect. So yeah, I guess one thing before we get too far into it, Bernard, again, thanks for coming on. We really do appreciate it. This is awesome. We can't do this show without great guests like you, and I'm so happy we get to talk to you again.
Very pleased to be here.
Yeah. I guess one thing is just sort of what have you been up to in the last year or so? What's going on in Bernard Joy land?
Oh, well, just navigating the existential angst that is the academic job market, and this, that, and the next thing. I mean, I do a power of writing, really. I mean, it's if I'm not reading, I'm writing. Really, it's just, I mean, it's always very difficult to talk. I mean, you guys know this. You're doing the same thing, but you talk to anyone on this subject, it's very hard to impart what it is that you are doing, because to the outsider it just looks like you're just sitting there. You've always got a book in your hand. They don't see what's going on in the inside, and right. You write, you read, you write, you read, you rinse and repeat. It just continues and continues. But I'm just glad that I'm still trucking along with it, because it can be a difficult thing. It can be a sort of isolating thing to write, to read.
Yeah.
I think mainly because you don't encounter so many people that are doing the same thing, so consistently. So it can be lonely.
Yeah, they're all at home writing and reading, Bernard.
Yeah,
and they're all home writing.
Exactly.
But, I mean, that's what communities like this one are good for. The podcasts thing. I'm very interested in podcasts these days, because it's got sort of like a third space. It's like you can say things on a podcast perhaps you wouldn't necessarily say in an essay, or you wouldn't necessarily say, if you were, in a really rigid academic setting or something like that. But you can sort of float ideas in this space, and it's got a community vibe to it. It's got a sort of people, working alone and then coming together to discuss the things that they've been thinking. So I like it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's one of that's been one of the boons of doing this show is we get to meet people like you, and we've met, we've made a bunch of friends now since we started
Mm,
doing this that, we wouldn't have interacted with beyond maybe a reply or a retweet here and there and gotten to know
mhm.
people a little bit. And it is as you say, there's something kind of isolated about whatever you want to call this sort of literary form of existence. I mean, I do much the same thing. I spend a couple hours a day working on my novel. I spend a couple hours a day prepping for this podcast. That's half my day, most days, it feels
Yeah.
like, or, something approximating that. And it does you go out with friends for a pint and you're like, what are you up to? You're like, "Ah, you don't want to know,
You
man."
can't see, what's that part from that great part from the film The Joker? That was
Mhm.
good. The last line or something. He says,
Yeah.
what's the joke?" And he
Yeah.
says, "You
You
wouldn't get
wouldn't
it."
understand it. Yeah, you wouldn't get it. Yeah, exactly.
Like that sometimes.
Yeah, so we'll kind of get into it here. I mean,
Mhm.
I guess, one question I kind of have, the longer we do these more interview form episodes, I've realized that I really like starting them off with a question that might be a little dumb, sort of. What and I think there's a great I think it's really cool to have your perspective on this because you're deeply invested in the subject. But I think some people might, if you can't tell by the accent, Bernard's not an American, but he focuses a lot of his energy and efforts in on American literature, at least from an academic standpoint. What characterizes to you, Bernard, Southern literature? All these writers we're going to talk about are all Southerners. What, beyond just existing somewhere below the Mason-Dixon, what is that? What's the commonality? What makes Southern literature?
Yeah, it's a great question to kick us off because I think for me that question is well, apart from the fact they are all Southern writers, the ones we'll be speaking about, that idea in itself, the idea of place, really organizes, I think, most of what we're going to talk about today. Because how I see it is the American experience in general is an experience, especially in the 20th century. We look at the 20th century. Faulkner was born in 1897.
Mhm.
And as we know, the others were born after that. Tennessee Williams is born in 1911.
Mhm.
Flannery O'Connor's born in 1925. So they are contemporaries. The others are younger.
Mhm.
So they're really writing about the dawning of the 20th century, and Flannery O'Connor writes right into the middle of the 20th century. And I see it as the American experience of the 20th century is one of absolute crisis. You've just had recently the American Civil War. The everything is aftermath to that. Even Flannery O'Connor herself, the youngest of the three, lives in a time completely typified by this massive crisis that's just taken place.
Yeah, she knew, like, I believe if I remember right from doing the biographical investigation, the priest of her church had been like a drummer boy in the Civil War. Like there were
That's
living
right. Yeah.
people who
Hmm.
had been in the war or adjacent to it. And
Yeah.
yeah.
So very, very like, I mean, Faulkner being so much, quite a bit older, um, very much the same experience, not much different because Faulkner had these people these touchstones that took him directly back to the Civil War.
Mhm.
And so does Flannery O'Connor. She has the touchstones that take her right back to the Civil War. So that massive crisis, bloodiest event uh, in the history, uh, has taken place really within their family memory, if you like. And then we have the First World War, we have the Second World War, we have the Cold War. All of these massive conflicts, international conflicts, they take place within the life frames of these writers. And then you've got the Great Migration, and then you've got the emancipation in general, and what that's done to racial dynamics. You've got the 19th Amendment,
Mhm.
which has completely changed gender dynamics. You've got industrialization has taken off to a massive degree. You've got moves towards new technologies of containment and control, and also a drive towards a national standardization. So everything's to be standardized. And you see
Yeah.
that in Faulkner to a great degree, because you see that there's a great moment in Pylon, the novel Pylon, where he talks about the small towns of America that would all have traditionally been their own places. You would have went to one place and you would have seen a very distinct place. And he says in Pylon, he says all the small towns are now looking exactly the same aesthetically. And he blames it on California. He blames it on Hollywood. He says, you see it there on the silver screen,
Mhm.
and well,
That's
you just
that's
emulate it.
It's funny how much of a narrative that still is. You go to places. I spent a lot of time in. I lived for a while in Boise, Idaho, which great American city, but kind of in the middle of nowhere, and had sort of developed somewhat on its own, a little bit in isolation, at least relative to a place like somewhere along the eastern seaboard.
Mhm.
And then during my time there, a lot of Californians were starting to move there because the property, values were cheaper, and you didn't have as much traffic and everything. And you could tell that the people who lived there for a long time were like, "We're becoming Californianized." Like
Yeah,
this is not what it was 5 years,
yeah.
10 years ago. Yeah, so that trend continues.
Faulkner says in the passage, it's a wonderful passage, and it connects to some of the things we talk about, especially later on. We'll talk about Burroughs, William S. Burroughs as well in the next session.
Yeah.
But this idea of a virus, a social virus, because he talks about that California thing as being like as though celluloid were a germ.
Oh
So it just
boy.
takes over the mind, and it takes over how we think aesthetically. But
Yeah.
just I'll come back to the original question though. Very
Sure. Yeah, no, this is great. This is great.
yeah. So I've painted a picture there of like the American experience is one of crisis, and I'm what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of crisis is any change is crisis, because you get into a habit, you get into the way of living, the way of seeing and existing in the world is a certain habit. And it's extraordinarily difficult when that habit completely becomes redundant, because you've now entered into a new frame. And all these things, changes in racial politics, changes in gender, changes in even how your town looks,
Mhm.
completely changed. And I think that's the American experience. But the Southern experience, the Southern American experience, I think is the acutest form of that, because the Southern system was, well, for instance, slavery, so much more
Mhm.
important to the infrastructure, to just the way people lived everyday lives in the South.
Mhm.
And when we have emancipation, scrubbed out overnight.
Right. And
And
as much as, historically we're pretty much, everybody's on board, that's a good thing. It is still traumatic in terms of just how
well, that's
how
why.
everything is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
trauma involved. This is what's. I find this is a really difficult thing. I find to speak honestly and truthfully about things, because there's so many knee-jerk reactions. So when I say crisis,
Mhm.
I don't mean negative,
Mhm.
because there's crises that are good.
Mhm.
If you have an unjust system and that it goes into crisis, well, it's went into crisis. But there will be people, and it's good, and in a sense, it's very good that it's gone into crisis.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but there will be people whose entire lives were founded upon that unjust system, that the slavery, the peculiar institution, um, and their lives were depended upon this. And yes, there will be also anxiety and trauma.
Mhm.
This is being human.
Right, right.
We're not we are, and I think I also like to always think about is we're not living in a just system now either.
No. No.
I like to do this. I always like to just show people iPhone,
Right.
yeah, and just
Yeah.
say, how do you think your iPhone's made?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and when you go about with your iPhone, you're not thinking. And if I said to you, I need to take your iPhone away because of what's happening in Africa to get
Right.
the raw materials that go into your iPhone, not one person would say, "Oh yes, go okay then. Here's
Right.
my iPhone." So we live founded on systems that
Mhm.
if they changed overnight, it would cause us massive anxiety. But we would
Mhm.
have to own up to the fact that if they did change overnight, it may be for the good.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, that's funny. You take away my iPhone,
Yeah, nobody would.
everybody's a a freedom fighter until their
Just
iPhone gets taken away.
just begging somebody to come and take mine. I've
Yeah,
got
it
five
probably you'd
thousand
probably
dollars.
be better off.
Yeah, absolutely. This
Can't
is a
do it myself.
this is a bit of an aside, but Larry McMurtry in the '60s was already writing about Texas becoming California. There's a
Mm.
great book of Texas essays called "In a Narrow Grave," where he writes about that.
Ooh, that's a good title.
And that's just an aside worth picking up. But that whole Californication thing is just such a fascinating dynamic. We're all Californians now. The French
Yeah,
are Californians now.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's we another series that does a good job of showing that is Mad Men. The very
Mm.
end of Mad Men, Mad Men is that moment that he goes out there, of course, and then he has that explosive realization that he can see the future now, and he'll make it. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's a very very tricky thing, right?
yeah, yeah.
Hmm. It's like
And
sort of we've all been colonized, but you can't
mhm.
quite put a finger on who's done it.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, there's really not one specific thing to blame exactly. It's
Well,
all
and also it's sort of like wonderful. I mean, you talk about the iPhone, right?
Mhm.
California product,
Yeah.
right? Product to
Yeah.
California. I mean, are our lives net better because of it? Probably.
It
Certainly, we're addicted to it. Yeah,
Yeah,
go on.
well, and the things of which it has improved our life have changed them in ways that your grandparents couldn't have anticipated, right? So it's definitely tricky. I do wonder, thinking back on the southern thing, going back to the Civil War, I do wonder if there's something about the North versus the South in which in the South it perhaps all this crises and change feels even more foisted on you than it does, say, living in the North, where in the North, perhaps you can envision it as like you're part of this sort of narrative of progress, whereas perhaps in the South, it feels like it's being dropped on you and you're forced to endure it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is something to that. I mean, I think you have to, it has to be remembered that the actual physical cost, material cost of losing the Civil War was immense. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
like uh, the whole industrial world was brought down to zero, and there was and just ordinary people felt the pain of that, the real pain of that,
Mhm.
in the South. I think maybe it's probably overdone. This whole dichotomy, I think, because a lot of things actually are overdone. Because people look at it, like for instance, race relations in the United States. Everyone tends to look to the South because I mean, race relations in the United States before the Civil War, antebellum,
Mhm.
people tend always to look at the South, but they don't tend to see what's happening in the North. There was there was different kinds of racism, just you know, um, in a sense, well, it can't be just as bad, but
Mhm.
but it's certainly that it's racism that's perhaps overlooked in the grand scheme of things because people look to the South
Yeah.
and they don't
Yeah.
look to what was going on in the North. So I don't think everyone in the North wasn't progressive.
Right.
So
Well,
this,
yeah, no, too, and this is, I'm gonna say some words that are not mine, but when we did our episode on Zora Neale Hurston, great writer and anthropologist of the South, she kind of typified this split between the North and the South in terms of racism. Again, this is her, just what she said, and I think about this from time to time. She said that, let me see if I can get this right. In the South, white people hated black people as a group, but could definitely love an individual black person.
Mm.
And in the North, they claimed to love black people as a population, but would hate the individual. And so she preferred the Southern variety.
Yeah, yeah.
And obviously that's a huge generalization, but I
Mm.
think you're right that and it maybe is something that people in the North get to do. They get to say, well, the racism's down there. It's
Yeah.
not really up
Oh,
here.
oh,
We're
but
fine.
that is
Yeah.
100% the case. I mean,
Mhm.
the South, and this is, I mean, this what I'm about to say is not controversial in the least, to my knowledge. The South is scapegoated. You know, you can say, especially if you've had this big climactic war and vast amount of population has been wiped out, you can then say the guys who did it, it's their fault.
Right.
And for 100 years, you can say, over there,
Yeah.
that's where racism is.
Yes.
And you can continue on being as racist as you like, really.
Right.
And just it's those guys that done it. And that's not controversial. I think people realize this. It perhaps took people a long time to come to the realization that that was going on. But you know, Zora Neale Hurston, that's sort of her take is very like that. In any case, she's very she was very for a sort of looking at racial politics, and actually she was very post-racial in the way she looked at things. She wanted to look at a world of individuals rather than individuals with racial affiliations and racial politics. Of course, that's problematic. That's got its problems, and she also had major problems with Richard Wright over this. Richard Wright would really did, you know, there was lots of sort of arguments between the two because Richard Wright is a very political person. It's another interesting thing for what we're talking about today, because I think if you look at it, I think Faulkner's got a bit of this. Certainly Tennessee Williams has. Tennessee Williams says, I'm not a political person.
Right.
It's as clear as you can get. And you know, he comes into a lot of trouble for that, especially after, we might talk about this later, but after the Stonewall riots, after 1969, people start to read Tennessee Williams completely differently. And he doesn't come off the better for it, because this idea of being an anti-political person or not a political person, well, you know, these days it's some people can't even conceive of this. If you were to say, I'm not political, people would say everything's political.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, I've got a complicated sort of relationship with that idea as well. I mean, I think
we all do. I think we all do now. I mean, right? It's Well, let's talk about Tennessee Williams a little bit, because
I'm political in exactly the right way.
Unlike everybody else.
Saturday, April 27th. Whatever will advance my cause. Whatever will let me carry the banner of House Atreides forward.
Right. Yeah. That's what I agree with.
Anyway, go on.
I've still not seen the second Dune, actually. I must.
You should. Yeah. It's
really good. I was so disappointed with the first.
I was too. I went and I saw the second one 7 times at the cinema. Bernard, go. I really don't do that. I don't do that. Go to the movie theater, please. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, it's worth it. It is worth it. It's one of those things. It's worth.
There's a north-south divide on Arrakis as well. It's a major factor in in any case, everything is Dune now, Brad.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, I'm okay with it. I mean, I got a Dune poster right there.
Yeah, right there. Okay. So, go on.
Let's talk about Tennessee Williams a little bit. You know, as this episode is approaching, sometimes when we do these dark rooms, I kind of go back and I'll listen to the core episode, just to kind of refresh some of the biographical stuff. And Tennessee Williams is a fairly early episode for us, and Kevin covered that, so some of the details I'd kind of forgotten. You're saying that, so after Stonewall, people kind of went back and reevaluated. Let's talk about that. I mean, I know there's a way of looking at some of Tennessee Williams' work, maybe all of it, in which it's queer coded subtly, or perhaps not so subtly. How did this kind of change after Stonewall?
Well, what happens is, and this is something that's really not very well, I would say not very well even acknowledged even today, that there is there's 2 parts, really. We can split Tennessee Williams' career into 2 halves, and he doesn't come off the better for criticism in either half of his career. The first half is before 1969, roughly, and the Stonewall, and the second half is after. before Stonewall, before the advances of the gay liberation movement, uh, Williams is considered by, you know, his work's been considered by really homophobic criticism. So the idea is lots of sort of ideas about he can't write heterosexual, even if he tries to write heterosexual couples. Actually, what he's done is he's coding it, so it's actually the female is a male, and they're actually a homosexual couple, and he's trying to sort of sneakily bring in his gay agenda here. Or
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So you basically write a homosexual love affair relationship, and then you just say one of them is a woman.
As a woman, yeah. So that was the charge that was always meted against Williams, that's what he was doing. And, you know, if you read some of the criticism from before, that, you know, before in the 1960s, especially in the 50s with you had the Red Scare in the 50s, but you also had the Lavender Scare in the 50s. So when you read that criticism, it's really, really bad criticism. I mean, it's horrible, the things that are saying, right? It's on homophobic grounds, right?
Now, would this be in like mainstream like reviews, or was this in academia as well?
Absolute 100% mainstream. The best journals in America all were publishing things that were completely homophobic.
Oh boy,
there's no other way of putting it.
Right.
So that's before Stonewall. After Stonewall, what you would expect is that the new liberated America might embrace someone like Tennessee Williams.
Yeah, this guy's been you know, secretly coded, but he's been, you know, pounding this drum his whole career or whatever.
He's a veteran of this. We might expect people to say he's a veteran of this. He's been undercover. He's been trying his best to get this message out, even though he's getting this scathing homophobic criticism. No such thing happens. What happens is people say, so we have here a sort of, and really, actually, the criticism is almost as bad, because you get this sort of sense of the critics saying that he's a self-loathing homosexual or something like that. That he has spent his career hiding. And because what they wanted, what gay theatre wanted after Stonewall was hyper visibility and for the playwright to be hyper political. So they really wanted work that was really speaking the politics of the day, real gay liberation politics. And explicitly so, they wanted it really explicit. When they look at Tennessee Williams, they say, no, we don't want Blanche Dubois mooning about, talking about, the lost antebellum and sort of anything that she says that's queer is coded and hidden, right? We don't want that. We want it explicit. So, and really, the criticism of that period is really quite nasty to Tennessee Williams. It really sort of it just it makes him and it in a sense it destroys his career, really, because if you think about it, the people say that the last great play that Tennessee Williams ever did was Night of the Iguana, which Night of the Iguana was 1959. So after all the 60s, all the 70s, all the 80s, his work deteriorates. Lots of critics now, though, are reappraising the later work. I mean, that's a real big thing in Tennessee Williams studies now, to reappraise those plays and to actually think, were they successful artistically and aesthetically? And there is good arguments that they were more successful than they were given credit for. Just during that period of time, they were.
Yeah. I'm not really familiar with his work after Night of the Iguana. What's a example of a play maybe people should take a look at?
Yeah. I mean, this is the reason, people even who take a great interest in Tennessee Williams they don't know these plays, because they're just they were so sidelined at the time that they just weren't given I mean, it comes to a point after Night of the Iguana, nobody even bothers writing about him anymore, right? He's just seen as such a fringe figure that they just say, well, he's not relevant anymore, right? He's just that's it. But ones to look at, a house not meant to stand. A House Not Meant to Stand was written in 1980s, so it's near the end of his life.
Oh, yeah.
A great one. A House Not Meant to Stand is really shows there's a change in Williams at this as he nears the end of his life, and everything gets even darker, if you can believe it. We're no longer the sort of melancholia that we get, and even the darkest moments of something like Streetcar Named Desire, it gets much darker. It's just A House Not Meant to Stand is just about decay and death and hopelessness, really.
Probably in part because his career has just
exactly
dissipated.
It's a response to that. It's a response to not only, I mean, Williams did start to think about his own mortality a lot more seriously. Obviously, as he's getting older. But it was all wrapped up with this idea that his career was dead too. I mean, and that is really a way to think of the latter career of Tennessee Williams. That's how he thought about it. He thought about it as dead. But he thought his career was dead. I mean, he knew he would never get in Broadway again or anything like that. But actually, he has a creative response to that too. It's not just doom and gloom. He doesn't give up.
Right.
He knows he won't do Broadway plays. Or he rather just gives up on Broadway because he's had failures in it by this point, just because it's sort of rigged against him at this stage.
Right.
That's how he sees it, at least. And so he says, "Well, give up on Broadway." But the creative thing that he does is he goes off Broadway, which actually in those days was really cutting edge. No one did it. So to start like a little indie theatre somewhere, and to put the play on there. So a lot of his, and again, that's the reason why even to this day, even people with a good interest, they don't know the latter plays because they didn't get these big Broadway openings or things like that. They got, and some of the little indie theatres were, they only opened for a year or something like that. They were really tiny little operations, and they were putting on these Tennessee Williams plays. I mean, amazing to think. A few other ones that This Is a Peaceable Kingdom, 1981. Great one to look up. Again, it's something about death. Again, he's been very morose. It's set in a old folks' home, and it's really it's a funny one, that one, because although Tennessee Williams said he wasn't a political person, his very first plays that he ever wrote were very political. As a young man, he wrote very, very pointedly political plays about organizing and things like that, about protest. And this last one, This Is a Peaceable Kingdom, has a little bit of that old revolutionary Tennessee Williams flair because he's sort of thinking about the people in an old folks' home being sort of rebellious against that system. He's thinking of an old folks' home as a system.
Right.
And if you think about it, it's quite a way to think about it, because when you get to that age, your life it seems to be entirely directed by the state, and you can't do anything about it. You're just pulled into this system, can't do anything.
Right.
And it's about how do you, that plays about how do you maintain your humanity in that system.
Yeah, and makes sense as a sort of metaphor for his life and his career, and thereby, everybody operating in that milieu. Very interesting. Yeah, so we're gonna have to revisit some of these older Tennessee Williams.
One last one I'll mention, because it speaks again to this idea that Tennessee Williams towards the end, he didn't just give up, he became more daring in a lot of ways. So one of his plays, a 1976 play, it's called The Remarkable Rooming House of Madame Lamond. And no one's heard of this one.
I've never heard of that, no.
But that is absolutely absurdist. I mean, we're talking, it's like Pinter, right?
Okay.
It's like Harold Pinter, or it's like Samuel Beckett. It's very like Samuel Beckett. So it's really absurdist, and it's totally it's totally sexual. It's like nothing he's ever done in his earlier career. It's like sadomasochistic.
Interesting.
He's taking when he's doing that newer stuff, he's taking more risks because he doesn't need to worry about the censor in Broadway. He doesn't need to worry about.
Yeah.
He's free in a sense.
Right. He's not going to be part of that system no matter what anyway. So I love to see. I really am interested to see what artists do sometimes later in their career when they've sort of what they've learned about how their world, how the commercial aspect of things works for them. And with the choices that they decide to make, you'll see some people that they just keep trying to sort of rehash what was successful for them. And like, why isn't this work? Why isn't the thing work that I did when I was 30 or whatever? And then you get people like Tennessee Williams, who's just like, well, apparently I can't do that anymore. So I'm going to keep trying new things, keep experimenting, kind of keep the artistic fire alive. And I think that's really cool. That's like, it reminds me of, Ridley Scott made that Napoleon movie last year. Wasn't great, but I kind of loved it because you're like, here's this like 85-year-old guy, and he's just gonna take on maybe the most ambitious thing he ever did. Like, I just admired the audacity of it. Like, it filled me with hope as as an artist. Like maybe you can still keep doing, at least trying stuff. As you get older. Very very cool. Let's talk about Flannery O'Connor a little bit. This is for Art of Darkness, this is the most recent subject we covered, and I just had a fantastic time digging into her life. And I had read the short stories and I'd read Wise Blood. I hadn't read all of the short stories, and I kind of pretty much more or less have now. And her the Violent Buried Away, which I am just in awe of. What do we make of her? I guess when Flannery O'Connor comes up for you, I got a couple questions here, but what is maybe the first story or book that comes to mind for you when Flannery O'Connor is mentioned?
Well, at the moment, it's the Violent Bear It Away. That's the one I've been working on most recently, so that's the one that always pops into my head. Oh, a good man is hard to find. Always pops in. That's the short story just pops in right away. But I actually think that the Violent Bear It Away is an excellent novel. And I think it's one of our best. And I think like I'm not just focusing on it because it happens to be the one I'm looking at. I think it is actually it's up there, and I think it's one that's touches on so many of our concerns and at the same time.
Yeah.
They all seem to be in there.
It's an amazing. To me, I found it just my jaw was on the floor for half of it. It's so strong in the choices she makes, and she's always she never like pulls punches, right? It's always gonna go. She's always gonna go intense. She's always gonna go for the thing that's gonna get a reaction out of somebody. Yeah, she's she's such a wit. I absolutely I just totally adore her. So what in your upcoming talk at the American Language Association, what you're talking about all three of these figures, Faulkner, O'Connor, Williams. What is the and maybe we've sort of touched on this, but maybe if we have, let's try to draw it in some bolder lines. What is the sort of connective tissue between these, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've touched on it slightly. I mean, the idea of the South as a site, a real site of crisis. So what do we do then if the entire system by which we lived, every supposition we had has dissolved, and it's dissolved recently? What happens? Well, I think what happens, or I think what these authors show us happens, is that you break into different camps. You break into the camp that says, "Yay, crisis, let's go," and these people will be the ones that are trying to come up with new ways of doing things. These will be the ones that will be thinking of sort of very heterodox views, things, modern views, things like this. And then you get the group that are the orthodox people. And those are the people who say to themselves, okay, how can we try and retain something of what it is we've lost? How can we take the shreds of this broken social system and bring it back together into something that works in a way that we consider to be orthodox? So that's the sort of system you find yourself in. With Flannery O'Connor, of course, her Catholicism comes into it to a great degree. So, she talks about the South as Christ haunted. She says that the South is no longer Christ centered, but it's now Christ haunted. And that's the central theme of like a novel, of course, like Wise Blood. Where you get Hazel Motes who's doing the main character who's anti-religious, but also anti-religious, but also haunted by religion at the same time. The two things happen at once. You've got the character that is completely torn between what used to be this really Christ-centered society and one that is completely secular now. But you can't leave the old behind, and you can't adopt the new, and you're stuck in a sort of limbo. And that's what you find.
And her most prominent characters kind of seem like they're almost like a schizophrenic. They can't exist in either of them, and so they sort of exist nowhere in a way. Hazel Motes and I'm blanking on him, but from The Violent Buried Away, the uncle. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that revolution was so much about I guess into personal independence and breaking away from the misery of, I guess, religious dogmatism, the church authority, all of it. But then you look around and it just seems like, has secularism made anybody happy? Were we just fleeing? Are we just repeatedly sort of collectively fleeing human misery?
Yeah.
And then, and it's cosmetic, but go on.
Yeah, I think that's the Violent Buried Away. That's what's happening. I mean, you've Francis Marion Tarwater, the protagonist, is pulled in the two directions, and I think there's something really fascinating goes on between how he's pulled in two directions. So just for people who maybe not know the novel, there's Francis Marion Tarwater was. Sometimes it's difficult with the names in this because everyone's called Tarwater and something. So Francis Marion Tarwater was kidnapped as a child by his great uncle, who's sometimes called in the novel Old Tarwater. So Old Tarwater steals this child, takes him away, and he has an uncle called Raybar, who is a school teacher. And the school teacher was supposed to come and sort of rescue him from this old man. And the old man's a religious fanatic. And he's trying to bring this boy up as a religious fanatic. The school teacher, Raybar, is a complete materialist, a secularist. And as I say, he's supposed to come and steal the child back, bring him back to civilization and the civilizing sort of schooling and things like this, things that will civilize the boy. But he doesn't. He just leaves him.
Right. Old Tarwater, I think, scares him off, shoots him, or shoots at him. He shoots him.
I suppose I'm being unfair on Raybar because he is shot, not just shot, but deafened.
Right.
By being shot. So that scares him off and he goes away. But years and years later, Old Tarwater dies, and Tarwater, the protagonist, decides, well, first of all, he burns the whole place down, as you do when you leave.
Yeah, sure.
And he goes and decides to find his uncle Raybar. And then it's all set up between, should he carry out the task that Old Tarwater wanted him to carry out, which was to baptize a boy called Bishop. Should he baptize this boy and therefore become this sort of religious fanatic? Or should he go into Raybar's way of life? Raybar wants him to go to school, wants him to learn, wants him to become basically a materialist, a secularist. And the whole novel is just, the discussions between Tarwater and Raybar trying to pull in these two directions. But I think the interesting thing is the protagonist, Tarwater, he he's neither one nor the other. So this like we're talking about that sort of liminal character. He's in between the two.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
I think
he partially burned down the house because he sort of hated his uncle in a way. He loves or his great uncle, but he also loved his great uncle. It's beautifully done, actually, the turmoil and the ambiguity of young Tarwater's relationship to all this. But yeah, please go on.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think like a really complex thing happens if you ask me my reading of it. Um, that although he's being pulled in two directions, Tarwater wants to keep his individualism, right? And this is where we come into the sort of, not a political writer or not a political playwright. There's the impulse in human beings to say, no, I'm not going to join your camp, and I'm not going to join your camp. I'm not going to be the religious fanatic or the secularist. I'm going to make my own decisions in life.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where and you've got to remember he's a very young boy, he's a very young teenager. So he's quite rambunctious. He's got his own mind. He wants to do his own thing. And this is my reading. He discovers, I believe, that it's impossible to be an individualist. Right? You can't be entirely individual. You're dragged in one direction or you're dragged in the other. And there's actually, I could read a passage to that effect. Could I?
Yeah, please. We love it. Yeah.
Because I think this really speaks to it. This is the kernel of what I'm saying. There's a point at which Raybar decides that if he takes Tarwater back, now that he's seen the big city, or the biggest city he's seen in his life, and he sees this, if we take him back to the country now, to the old woods that he once lived in, then he will realize how silly it is to be so provincial as this old man that he grew up with. And he thinks that will jolt him out of it and he'll come back to reality. So he takes him out to this nice lake area and he's trying to get him to think this way. But Tarwater knows all the time. Tarwater's saying, no, you're just trying to make me do your thing. You're trying to make me go to school and civilize me, right? So I'm not doing it. So he thinks, Tarwater thinks, how am I going to not do this? How am I going to reject this? But it's interesting what he says. He says this is Tarwater's words. He says, you can't just say no. You got to do no. You got to show it. You got to show you mean it by doing it. You got to show you're not going to do it one thing. Sorry, you've got to show you're not going to do one thing by doing another. Right? Now, that's an interesting passage to me because he's saying, again, to my reading, he's saying, it's no good sitting in the middle. You can't sit in the middle and say, I'm not doing your thing and I'm not doing your thing. If this guy comes up and says, be a fundamentalist Christian, you've got to do something to show him no.
Right.
And the only real thing you can do to show him no is what the other guys do.
Yeah.
And then if he comes up, you've got to do, no, I've got to do. So he's trapped in this sort of web of having to act. In order to be an individual, he's got to do this, the sort of, he's got to enact the sort of social pattern of the opposite thing.
Right. That's beautifully put. Yeah, it's like you don't actually get to forge your own way. You're just camping and decamping between the two based on wherever you sort of feel pressure at the moment, right? Yeah, it's very interesting. Oh no, I thought I was forging my own path, Bernard. Maybe I'm not.
If you look, I mean, I put on Twitter there just before I came on that I wouldn't mention Pierre Bourdieu.
Oh, let's mention him. Let's do it. I don't know who that is.
I'll mention him. He's a French sociologist, and I think that a lot of what he has to say really speaks to me, and it's really formative of these readings that I have. And I think that it can sound very depressing. This idea of being socially determined. A lot of what I was saying earlier is from Pierre Bourdieu. You've got the the received way of doing things, the received way of seeing and acting in the world, which Bourdieu calls doxa. People know that word anyway, but that's what he refers to it as. And he says, when we have crisis, and as I'm saying, like the Southern society itself is a crisis in crisis, doxa splits into orthodoxy or heterodoxy.
Right. Two different responses to crisis.
Two different responses to
and
crisis.
Those are psychologically, like those exist in the individual too. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're sort of driven down one path or the other. But I think if you read someone like Pierre Bourdieu and lots of other philosophers closely enough, you find that what is happening is there's a dialectic between those two things, that the determinism and the free will. There's a dialectic. So I always, because it depresses me deeply as well. If someone says to me, "Oh, you're socially determined," I think to myself, "What's the point?"
Yeah, I don't like that at all.
I don't want that. I don't like it. I don't like it.
I'm of the camp of like, even if that's like quote unquote scientifically true, I don't tell me that. I'm not going to live like that.
But I bring you good. I bring you good news, because I think that no one's saying that. I don't think Pierre Bourdieu says that. I don't think I think most people that you say that this philosopher's a social determinist. Once you start to read into it, you certainly with Pierre Bourdieu, totally with him. When you read into it, he's saying there's a dialectic between the two things. He never says that you're an automaton. You're making your decisions, yes, but you're making it within, a sort of a context.
Yeah.
And you make certain choices within certain contexts.
Yeah. And I think probably, I didn't expect to get into the conversation about free will determinism here. This is cool. I think probably, realistically, if you are trying to maintain a radically individual identity, you probably are best served by understanding that the vast influence on you and the choices you have, the choices you make are determined, right? So that way, maybe you can sort of focus on that small part of yourself in which you can make decisions, right? In which you are able to evaluate individually.
I mean, the great way of thinking about it, in terms of Bourdieu anyway, is a football game. That was his metaphor for a football game, and that really helps us to understand, doesn't it? If you're going to play a football game, you must apply all the rules of the football game, right? They're all set, right? There's no point you going in there and doing a ballet dance,
right? Yeah,
right?
You're not going to win. You're certainly not going to win.
You won't win, and for Bourdieu, everything is driven by winning and losing. It's all about the attainment of capital, some form of capital. But it takes place within very much the same as a football game or any form of game. In fact, the word he uses in French is game.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah.
So, but having said that, who could say that a football player, think of your favorite football player or whatever. I don't do really sports, but you think of your favorite. Why do we love these great athletes? Because they have a personal flair. We don't like them because they go on and they're automatons, robots.
Right.
We like them because they see the play.
Yeah.
They go, within this framework that I've been put, I've seen the creative choice. I know what to do, and that's where the free will is. And athletes do it, yes, but we're all doing it. We're all doing it all the time. We've got here a game that we must play by the rules. But all the time, everyone is thinking, what's the best play? And that's what your free will is.
Ah, beautiful. I love that. Well, that's fantastic. That actually, I'm going to be thinking about this for the rest of the day. I think we're coming to the close on our hour here. We're gonna for the After Dark portion for our paid supporters on Patreon and now on Substack. That's Art of Dark Pod. Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod, Substack.com/@Art of Dark Pod. You'll get access to the bonus material that we do for every episode. today we're going to talk about, I didn't realize until after we sort of set this meeting up that Bernard Joy is also very interested in William S. Burroughs. So we're gonna spend some time talking about William S. Burroughs, which also gets me very excited. One of my favorite subjects. So join us behind the paywall for that. Bernard, tell people how to find you if they want it. You're a great Twitter follow, so people who are on Twitter should definitely follow you. But tell people where else can they find you? Can they find some of your writing out there as well?
Yeah, I mean I post mostly everything to Twitter. So Bernard T Joy at Bernard T Joy. That's where you find me. And you just actually Orchid, which is what you find. Yeah, Orchid, which is academic writing you find on Orchid. And just
great.
Keep my name in.
Look for Bernard G. Joy. And if you're in the Chicago area, or you happen to be going to the American Language Association, is it the conference? Tell us about that event a little bit.
Oh yeah, it's I'm looking forward to it. It's in Chicago. This will be my first outing to the United States in 14 years.
Oh wow. It's way different and exactly the same.
It's gotten worse. It's gotten worse. It's getting worse.
Well, just for context, the last time I was in America, there were posters up for Barack Obama's candidacy for president of the United States. So that long ago.
Wow.
And I think the country has changed considerably since then. And it's but it'll be interesting. I mean, I've never been to Chicago either. That's where the event is, and it's going to prove to be a great trip. I'm going to try and take in some of the galleries there as well.
Sure,
absolutely. Bernard, are you familiar with the film Killing Them Softly, the mob film set against the backdrop of
yes.
Yeah, maybe rewatch that to get a little coming attractions.
I'm going to Mississippi the next month. Well, actually in July. And I rewatched Mississippi Burning, which is like one of my favorite films. I love that film, so I rewatched that as a sort of. So I'll do Killing Them Softly as well.
All right. Well, for people who are listening to this who may run into Bernard Joy and his American wanderings, help him out. Show him a big, great American welcome.
Show to him that America isn't a PvP hellscape.
Right.
Unless you live here full time.
Yeah.
We'll be back after dark, right?
Yes.
Thank you,
absolutely.
Bernard.
Thank you so much, Bernard.
All right.
Thank you.